On the 28th of July, 2008, the grandest pier on the Bristol Channel caught fire, and within 90 minutes the entire pavilion was gone. When the owner walked onto the blackened deck the next morning, he found the 400 slot machines melted where they stood, the coins inside them fused into lumps you could carry off by the wheelbarrow. It was the second time this pier had burned to the waterline, and it was only the most recent thing Weston-super-Mare had watched itself lose, on a shore where the sea itself refuses to stay. Weston-super-Mare has not emptied out. In 2024, the local council counted about 4.2 million day visits to the town, and close to £200 million spent by the people who made them. The trippers still come. What has gone is the reason they used to come. 100 years ago, this was one of the great resorts of the west of England, a place families came to for a week or a fortnight, drawn by the largest sands on the Bristol Channel, and a seafront that seemed to hold everything a holiday could offer. Today, they come for an afternoon. The town that once pulled 78,000 people onto its beach in a single August bank holiday has lost its oldest pier to the mud, its record-breaking Lido to 15 years of rot, and its finest pier twice over to fire. And almost all of it traces back to one stubborn fact about the water. Weston sits on the Severn estuary, where the tide has one of the greatest reaches anywhere on earth, often said to be second only to the Bay of Fundy in Canada. Twice a day the sea comes in across the flats, and twice a day it draws out again, and when it goes out at Weston, it goes almost a mile, leaving behind a shining expanse of brown estuary mud. Long before the resort had a name worth printing on a poster, the visitors had already given it another one. They called it Weston-super-Mud. That mud is the thread that runs through everything that follows. Without it, there would be no resort here at all, and yet, time and again, it is the mud that has undone the resort's grandest work. Weston kept trying to reach past it to the sea, and the mud kept quietly winning. To understand how strange the whole thing is, you have to start at the beginning, when there was almost nothing here at all. At the turn of the 19th century, Weston was a fishing hamlet of a few dozen cottages under a wooded hill, with a single track leading down to the shore. When the first census was taken in 1801, the entire population was a little over 100 people. There was one inn, there was a parish church, a scatter of lodging houses, and a great deal of sand, and beyond it, for much of the day, a great deal of mud. Nobody looking at the place would have called it the future of anything. What changed it was a Georgian fashion for the sea. In the late 1700s, English doctors had begun prescribing salt water the way an earlier age had prescribed the spa, sending patients to the coast to bathe in it and even to drink it, as a cure for everything from melancholy to gout. Weston had the sand and the safe shallow water, and it had the mud that meant no dangerous depths close in, and slowly the invalids began to arrive. The first hotel opened in 1810 in a building that survives today as part of the Royal Hotel. Bathing machines appeared on the beach, little wooden huts on wheels that a horse would draw down to the water, so a bather could change inside and step into the sea unseen from the sands. Modesty ran the whole arrangement. The sheltered cove at Anchor Head, round on the northern shore, was set aside as the bathing place for ladies, while the gentlemen thought nothing of stripping on the open beach and running down to the water in full view. It was a small, respectable, invalid sort of resort, and for a while that was all anyone expected it to be. The heart of it all was a small rocky island just off the front, joined to the shore by a natural ridge of pebbles that the tide covered twice each day. It was called Nightstone, and the name has a curious origin. When workmen dug the foundations for the first baths there, in the May of 1820, they turned up human bones and a broken pottery urn, and assumed they had found the grave of a Roman knight. The bones were much older than that. They belonged to the Iron Age, to people who had used this island 1,000 years before Rome ever reached Britain. The grave was not a knight's at all, but the name stuck, and Nightstone it has been ever since. The man who made Nightstone matter arrived in 1828. His name was Dr. Edward Long Fox, and he was a Quaker physician from Brislington, near Bristol, where he ran one of the most advanced private asylums in the country, a place built on the then radical belief that the mentally ill should be treated with kindness rather than chains. Fox held that sea bathing could treat the disorders of the mind and the body alike, and he bought Nightstone to put the idea to work. He raised the causeway with Cornish granite so it stood above the high tide, and in 1832 he and his son opened a purpose-built bathhouse on the island, with hot and cold saltwater baths, a reading room and an open pool fed by the incoming sea. The resort that would one day sell itself on donkey rides and slot machines began as a doctor's prescription. By 1831, the hamlet of 100 souls had grown to more than 1,300, and it was still reachable only by a long road across the Somerset levels. What turned a growing village into a boom town arrived on rails. In 1841, the Bristol and Exeter Railway opened a branch line down to Weston, at first so modest that the carriages were pulled along it not by a locomotive but by horses. It did not stay modest for long. Within 3 years, by 1844, some 23,000 people were arriving at Weston by train. In 1849, the town saw its first great excursion, when 1,600 workers from a Bristol cotton factory were brought down to the sea in a single day. This was the new thing the railways had made, the day at the seaside for people who had never before been able to reach it, and Weston, an hour from the factories and back streets of Bristol, was perfectly placed to sell it. The numbers carry the story better than any adjective could. The 2,000 people of 1841 had doubled to 4,000 by 1851. By the census of 1901, the population stood at 19,018. In 60 years, a fishing hamlet had become a town, and the engine of it was the crowd that poured off the trains and more off the boats, because the trains were only half of it. The other road to Weston ran across the water. Through the second half of the 19th century, the Bristol Channel filled up with paddle steamers, and the most successful of all the companies that ran them was P&A Campbell, whose ships wore a white funnel and became known up and down the coast as the White Funnel Fleet. From the late 1880s, the Campbell steamers ran daily excursions across the Channel from Cardiff and Penarth and Newport, carrying trippers from the valleys of South Wales straight across to the Somerset shore. On a fine August bank holiday around 1890, as many as 15,000 passengers came ashore at Weston, off the steamers alone, walking down the gangways and into the resort without ever touching a train. But every one of those ships met the same problem waiting at the shore, and it was the problem the whole town was built around: the mud. A paddle steamer needs deep water to come alongside, and at Weston, for much of the tide, there was no deep water anywhere near the beach. The town needed a way to reach out over the flats and meet the sea where it actually was. The answer was a pier. In 1867, Weston built one of the most remarkable piers in Britain, and it is remarkable to this day, even as a ruin. It was called Burnbeck, and it was designed by Eugenius Birch, the finest pier engineer of the Victorian age, the man behind the great seaside piers at Brighton and Eastbourne, and half a dozen resorts besides. What made Burnbeck unique was where it went. It did not run out into open water like every other pier in the country. It reached from the mainland across to Burnbeck Island, the rocky outcrop off the northern end of the front, and to this day it remains the only pier in Britain that links the shore to an island. It opened on the 5th of June, 1867, 1,150 feet of iron walkway, striding out over the rocks and the mud to a pierhead where the steamers could finally dock even at low water. The Gothic toll houses and pavilion that crowned it were designed by a local architect named Hans Price, whose buildings still stand all over the town. Burnbeck became a resort in miniature. Out on the island, the crowds found a pavilion and a bandstand, a switchback railway that was an early kind of roller coaster, a water chute that sent boats plunging into a pool, a maze, a helter-skelter, and a bioscope showing the first flickering moving pictures. Many of the visitors who came off the steamers never went any further into the town at all. They spent the whole day out on the pier and the island and sailed home again by boat. And for decades Burnbeck was the front door through which a large part of Weston arrived. An electric tramway opened along the seafront in 1902 to carry them from the pier approach into the town, 16 tramcars running nearly 3 miles of track. The resort was working exactly as its builders had intended. And then, as it would so often, the place caught fire. On Boxing Day of 1897, the amusements out on Burnbeck Island burned, taking the cafe and the pavilion with them. They were rebuilt. A few years later, in the autumn of 1903, one of the great storms of the age tore at the pier and destroyed its northern jetty, which had to be replaced in steel. Birnbeck kept being knocked down and kept getting up again, because for the moment it was still worth rebuilding. The steamers still came, the crowds still filled the island, and the town around it was still growing. But the very success of Birnbeck created the thing that would one day help to kill it. Weston decided it wanted a second pier, a bigger one, right in the centre of the seafront. And the story of that second pier is where the whole strange logic of this town comes into focus. They had been talking about it since the 1880s, and an Act of Parliament in 1893 finally cleared the way, but the work did not begin until the autumn of 1903. It was a serious piece of engineering. 600 iron piles had to be driven down into the estuary clay at a rate of 8 to 10 a day to carry a deck a quarter of a mile long. At the seaward end rose a pavilion that could seat 2,000 people, a theatre grand enough to stage opera and Shakespeare and ballet, and in time boxing matches. It opened on the 11th of June 1904 to a performance by an Italian orchestra, and it had cost £120,000, an enormous sum for the day. They called it the Grand Pier, and it was. But the company that built it wanted more than a theatre over the sea. It wanted a share of the steamer trade that was making Birnbeck rich at the other end of the front. So it did something audacious. Beginning in 1906, it built an enormous low-water extension out from the back of the pavilion, a jetty reaching so far into the bay that the whole structure ran to well over a mile in length, one of the longest piers ever attempted in England. There was even to be an electric train running along the deck to carry boat passengers from the toll gates out to the landing stage at the far end. The idea was to catch the steamers as they passed and to beat Birnbeck at its own game. And here the town's oldest enemy defeated its grandest ambition. The tide at Weston is so vast and it draws back so far that even a jetty reaching more than a mile from the shore still did not reach the sea at the lowest water. The mud that the extension had been built to conquer simply outran it. And where the water did reach the jetty, the currents around it ran so fierce and so treacherous that few captains would risk bringing a ship alongside at all. It scarcely ever worked. The great extension stood almost useless for a decade, a monument to a sea that would not cooperate, and between 1916 and 1918, most of it was pulled down and carried away. The tide that had built the resort would not let it grow any further. That single episode is the pattern of the whole town, and once you have seen it, you begin to see it everywhere in what came after. This is a place whose fortune was built on the sea, on a shore where the sea is barely present for half of every day. Everything grand it tried to build, it had to build against the mud. Sometimes the mud won slowly, and sometimes it won all at once, and sometimes it simply waited while fire did the work instead. Keep the image of that abandoned mile-long jetty somewhere close, because Weston is about to climb to its greatest height, and every fine thing it raises up there is standing on the same unstable ground. The peak, when it came, arrived first with flames. On the 13th of January 1930, the Grand Pier's Great Theatre, the 2,000-seat pavilion that had staged opera and Shakespeare for a quarter of a century, caught fire and burned. It was rebuilt within 3 years, but not as a theatre. When the new pavilion opened, it housed a fun fair, rows of amusements and machines rather than a stage, because tastes were shifting, and the future of the English seaside was no longer opera over the water. It was noise and lights and rides, and between the wars, Weston built that future faster and more lavishly than almost any resort in the country. The building spree of the 1920s and 30s was along the front. In 1927, the town opened the Winter Gardens, a grand Neo-Georgian pavilion with a sunken ballroom, set in formal gardens with a lily pond and a putting green, and it had cost £35,000. Its ballroom carried one of the most advanced coloured lighting systems in the country, and Weston gave it a name to match. They called it the House of 1,000 Lights. That same year, the town did something that tells you exactly how it saw its old enemy. It built a wall to trap the sea. Just north of the front, engineers threw a concrete barrier across the shore and created the marine lake, an artificial lagoon that filled at high tide and then held its water fast as the sea drew back across the flats. It was the town's answer to the mud in the most literal form imaginable. If the sea would not stay, Weston would keep a piece of it prisoner behind a wall, so that the children could always have somewhere to paddle even when the real tide had walked a mile out to the horizon. And then, in 1937, came the attraction that more than any other stood for the golden age of Weston-super-Mare. It was an open-air swimming pool, an Art Deco Lido built right on the seafront, and it opened on the 1st of July under the plain and confident name of The Pool. It was vast, 200 feet long by 140 wide, with room for thousands of bathers and spectators around the water. At the moment of its opening, the town declared it the largest open-air pool in Europe. That claim was a matter of civic pride, more than of measurement. Morecambe, up on the Lancashire coast, had opened a bigger open-air stadium a full year earlier, and Blackpool a larger one before that, and each of those towns had claimed the very same crown. What is not in dispute is the thing that stood at the centre of the Western Pool, the thing that made it unforgettable to everyone who ever swam there. A diving stage of white reinforced concrete, a tower of arched tiers rising high above the water, boards stepping up one above the other to a height that made the strongest swimmers hesitate at the top. It was the signature of the place, the shape on every postcard, and for a generation of Western children, the climb to the top of that tower was the great dare of the summer. The town was rich enough now to produce more than buildings. In the October of 1939, in the village of Uphill on the southern edge of Weston, a boy was born to an insurance salesman who had changed the family name a few years earlier from Cheese to Cleese. The boy was christened John. He would grow up to give the world Monty Python and Basil Fawlty, and to become one of the most recognisable Englishmen alive. But he began as a Western child, born on the edge of the sands in the last autumn before the war, and around the grand buildings ran the ordinary machinery of a great English seaside holiday. Lines of donkeys waited on the sands to carry children along the tide line. Deck chairs stood in ranks by the thousand. Buckets and spades worked the famous soft sand that the retreating tide left flat and firm for a mile, and when the real sea had gone out to the horizon, the bathers simply crossed to the marine lake and swam in the water the town had trapped behind its wall. This was Weston delivering exactly what it had promised, on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture now. Before the First World War, the biggest August bank holidays had brought around 38,000 people into the town. By 1921, that figure had risen to 51,000, and on the August bank holiday of 1937, the year the pool opened, 78,000 people came to Weston in a single day, packing the sands from the seawall down to the water's edge a mile away. This was a resort at the very top of its powers, a town that had turned a muddy shore and a fishing hamlet into one of the busiest playgrounds in the land. And then the country went to war, and Weston's strangest chapter began. When the Second World War came, the Admiralty looked at Birnbeck Pier, that iron walkway running out to a private island cut off from the shore at every high tide, and saw a use for it that had nothing to do with holidays. In 1941, the Navy requisitioned the whole of Birnbeck, the pier and the island both, and commissioned it as a shore establishment under a warship's name. They called it HMS Birnbeck. For the rest of the war, the island that had carried a switchback railway and a bandstand became a station of the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a body of brilliant and unorthodox engineers whose job was to invent the strange new weapons the war demanded. Officially, they were the DMWD. To everyone who worked with them, they were known as the Wheezers and Dodgers. What they did out on that pier was extraordinary. The island's isolation, the very thing that had always made it awkward for holidaymakers, made it perfect for testing devices that were dangerous and secret. Here they helped develop the Hedgehog, a weapon that fired a pattern of small bombs ahead of a ship to catch the submarines that older depth charges kept missing, and it became one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons of the entire war. Here too they worked on the Squid, a later anti-submarine mortar so effective that it stayed in service into the 1980s. The diary of one engineer, an Admiralty contractor working on the pier, records squids being tested from Birnbeck itself in 1943. And across the bay at Breandown Fort on the far side of Weston, a satellite station of the same secret establishment, They tested a version of the bouncing bomb, the weapon that would soon become famous for breaching the great dams of the Ruhr. The same secretive department, with Birnbeck as its experimental home, had a hand in far more than that. It worked on the degaussing systems that protected British ships from the magnetic mines the Germans had sown across the shipping lanes, and it played a part in developing the great floating Mulberry harbours that would be towed across the Channel to supply the armies after the landings in Normandy. The resort pier that had been built to carry trippers to an island had become a place where the tools of the war were dreamed up and tested in the dark. It was for a few years one of the most important stretches of the whole western seafront, and almost nobody was allowed to know it. The war did not leave the rest of the town in peace either. Weston had no docks worth bombing and no factories of any weight, but in the summer of 1942 the German Air Force came for it anyway, as part of a campaign that went after Britain's morale, its cathedral cities and its historic towns, rather than its docks and its factories. On the nights of the 28th and 29th of June 1942, the bombers came over Weston. They dropped 52 high-explosive bombs and more than 10,000 incendiary devices onto a seaside town, and the fires that took hold could be seen glowing across the water from Wales. When the raids were over, around 102 people were dead, and much of the older town centre lay burning or levelled. The earlier Winter Gardens complex on the boulevard was destroyed. A town built to sell an escape from ordinary life had been firebombed precisely because it was a place of pleasure. Even here, in the middle of a war, the pattern held. Weston burned. But the pier that had helped to win the war would not survive the peace, and the reason had nothing to do with fire or with tides. It had to do with the way the whole country was about to change, and with a competitor that Weston had built for itself. The first blow came from within the town. In 1946, the Grand Pier opened amusement arcades in the very centre of the front, and the crowds who had once ridden the tram all the way out to Birnbeck now had far less reason to make the journey. The old island pier, further from the station and harder to reach, began steadily to lose its trade to the newer one. The tram that had carried the visitors out to it had already gone, replaced by buses back in 1937. And then came the change that undid seaside towns all across Britain at once. Cheap foreign holidays. Through the 1950s and 60s, the package tour and the passenger jet put Spain within the reach of ordinary British families for the first time. A week of guaranteed sunshine on a Mediterranean beach began to look a great deal more tempting than a fortnight of hoping the clouds would lift over the Bristol Channel. The people who had once filled Weston for a week now flew abroad instead, and the ones who still came for a day rather than a fortnight. When the Severn Bridge opened in the 1960s, it made the crossing into Wales a matter of minutes by car, and it quietly took away one more reason to board a steamer. The White Funnel fleet, which had ruled the Channel for 80 years, went into a long decline. Regular steamer services to Birnbeck ended in 1971. The final excursion sailed from the pier on the 19th of October 1979, and that same year the Campbell Company itself folded, after nearly a century on the water. Birnbeck, its steamers gone and its crowds thinned, passed from hand to hand. The Pier Company had already sold it to the Campbell operators back in 1962. Later, it went to a man who tried to run it as a Victorian pleasure centre, a nostalgic attraction that, at one point, even carried special permission to issue its own private currency to its visitors. None of it held. The buildings decayed, the ironwork rusted in the salt air, and storms and neglect finished the work. In 1994, the pier was closed to the public as simply too dangerous to walk upon, and it has never reopened since. The only pier in Britain that reached out to an island now reached out to nothing, its decks sagging over the mud, its pavilion open to the sky, its Gothic toll house staring blindly across the water. For years afterwards, the lifeboat crews of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution went on launching from the island, the last living use the pier had. Then, in 2014, even they were forced off, because the walkway had grown too dangerous to cross to reach their own boat. The Lido went the same way, only more slowly. In 1982, the great white diving stage, the tower that had crowned the pool for 2 generations, was pulled down when the pool was reduced in size. The following year, the whole place was rebranded and relaunched as the Tropicana, wet and wild, aimed at a newer kind of visitor, and for a while it worked. But the crowds who could fill an open-air pool on the English coast were already flying to Spain, and the Tropicana was living on borrowed time. In the year 2000, it closed, and then came the cruelest phase of all, the one that would eventually make Weston briefly famous again for all the wrong reasons. It was not demolished. It was simply abandoned, left standing empty and open to the weather, right at the heart of the seafront, for the best part of 15 years. The concrete cracked and stained. Weeds pushed up through the empty basin where the water had once been. A structure the town had proudly called the largest of its kind in Europe, now rotted quietly in full public view, a great grey ruin in the middle of the front, impossible to ignore, and, for the longest time, impossible to fix. And it was not only the buildings that were hollowing out. As the resort economy fell away, the town behind the seafront suffered with it. The grand old boarding houses and hotels, built for visitors who no longer stayed the night, were carved up into cheap flats and bedsits. By the reckoning of the official deprivation figures, the most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole district came to lie here, in the central and southern wards of Weston-super-Mare, streets a few minutes' walk from the beach that had once drawn the crowds. The place that had sold happiness by the week to the entire west of England had become in parts one of the poorer corners of it. That is the deeper loss, underneath the burned piers and the ruined pool. The empty buildings were only the visible part of it. Behind them lay the thing that had drawn people to this shore for 150 years, the week or the fortnight by the sea, and that was the thing the country had simply stopped wanting. Which brings us back to the fire and to the 28th of July, 2008. By then the Grand Pier was under new ownership. A brother and sister, Kerry and Michelle Michael, had bought it that very year and had already spent heavily on it, determined to bring it back to life. And in the small hours of a July morning, an electrical fault set the pavilion alight. What happened next turned a disaster into a scandal. The pier's own fire alarm sent out its signal at 35 minutes past 1 in the morning to a private monitoring company, but the message never reached the fire brigade. No call came through. By the time the alarm was finally raised in person, hours later, it was far too late. The fire took 90 minutes to consume the pavilion, and when it was over, the great structure stood as a skeleton of scorched iron over the sea. The 400 slot machines inside had melted into the deck, and the coins that had filled them had run together into lumps you could carry off by the wheelbarrow. The owners later reached a settlement with the alarm firm over the failure that had let the blaze run unchecked. It was, agonisingly, the second time this pier had burned, 78 years after the first. But this time the story did not end in the ashes. The Michaels rebuilt, and rebuilt fast, and after a transformation the town reckoned at £52 million, the Grand Pier reopened in 2010, its pavilion new and its lights burning once more over the water. It is open to this day, the one great survivor of Weston's seafront, saved by a family who refused to let it become another ruin. Even that survival carried a small sting. The rebuilt pier cost so much to run that from the spring of 2014, the owners began charging £1 simply to walk onto it, a toll that later rose to £2, and more than 400 local people took to the pier's own page to complain. One of them wrote that Weston people had so little left to do in the town with their children that being charged to walk the pier felt like an insult. The free promenade over the water, the birthright of a seaside town, had quietly acquired a turnstile, but the smoke of 2008 had done something the fire itself had not intended. It had made Weston, once again, a place that people talked about, and the story of the town's decline had become, in a strange way, its most valuable asset. Nobody understood that better than the artist who arrived 7 years later. In the summer of 2015, the derelict Tropicana, that grey ruin the town had been unable either to demolish or to repair, was quietly taken over behind hoardings, and a rumour went round that a film set was being built inside. It was not a film set. On the 21st of August, the hoardings came down to reveal Dismaland, a work by Banksy the anonymous street artist from Bristol just up the road. Banksy had turned the rotting Lido into what he called a bemusement park, a dark parody of a theme park, its fairy tale castle sagging and its magic soured, filled with his own work and the work of 58 other artists he had gathered from around the world. It was bleak and funny and grim, and it fitted the ruined pool so precisely that it was hard to tell where the art ended and the genuine decay began. That was the point. A dying seaside attraction had turned out to be the ideal frame for an exhibition about disappointment. Dismaland ran for just 36 days, and in that time it drew, by one estimate, more than 150,000 paying visitors to Weston, and was reckoned to have brought something like £20 million into the town. People queued for hours and travelled from across the country to look at a ruined Lido in a faded resort, because Banksy had put his name on it. When it closed, the timber and fittings that had built it were taken down and shipped to Calais, to the refugee camp known as the Jungle, and used to build shelters for the people living there. The most talked about thing to happen to Weston in decades had been an exhibition about decline, staged inside one of the town's own most painful losses, and for one strange month people came from all over the country to see it. The old Lido kept drawing the strange and the spectacular after that. In the autumn of 2022, an entire decommissioned North Sea oil platform, 450 tons of steel rising some 35 metres into the air, was installed inside the empty pool as a public artwork called Sea Monster, the largest thing ever set down on the Western seafront. Crowds came to climb an oil rig where children had once queued for the diving boards. The Lido had become a stage for grand, temporary, faintly mournful spectacles, each one a reminder of the permanent thing that used to stand in its place. That could be the end of it, a town of ruins and one-off spectacles with its great age long behind it. But Weston's story has never run in a straight line downwards, and in the last few years the direction has begun, cautiously, to turn. The Tropicana is being brought back. The town council owns it now, and plans approved in May of 2025 will turn the old Lido into a large events venue, able to hold several thousand people, its 1930s frontage kept, and its later interior cleared away. The great grey ruin that Banksy made famous is finally being rebuilt, not as a swimming pool, but as somewhere to gather. And out at the northern tip of the seafront, the most improbable rescue of all is underway. Burnbeck Pier, closed and rotting since 1994, the pier the sea had all but reclaimed, was bought by the town council in 2023, and a restoration has begun that will cost far more than the pier ever earned in its heyday. As of the spring of 2026, the money committed to saving it had passed £44 million, after the government added a further £19 million to the fund, and the aim is to have the old pier open once more by the summer of 2027. The pier that runs out to an island, the one where the Weezers and Dodgers built their secret weapons, may yet carry visitors again over the mud that has spent so long trying to swallow it. Walk the modern front, and you find a town that is neither dead nor whole. The Grand Pier throws its lights over the water again. The marine lake still holds its trapped square of sea. Away from the seafront, the survivors are quieter and stranger. There is the Weston Museum, telling the town its own story. And out toward the airfield, there is the Helicopter Museum, the largest collection of its kind anywhere in the world. More than 80 aircraft, including the machine that once held the world helicopter speed record, a reminder that Weston built flying machines as well as sandcastles. On the front itself, there is a sea aquarium out on a small modern pier, where the Burnbeck steamers used to be the great draw. It is a resort still standing, still busy on a warm afternoon, but stripped back to its bones, its grandest century scattered in pieces along the shore. So the title on this video was never quite fair to the 4.2 million people who still come to Weston every year, and it was never meant to be. They come for the beach and the sand and an afternoon in the salt air, and the beach is still there, wide and golden and a mile deep at low tide, exactly as it always was. What they no longer come for is the thing Weston spent a century and a fortune building on top of that beach. The steamers that once carried 15,000 people ashore in a day are gone. The pier they landed at stands empty on its island. The pool that was the pride of the front rotted for 15 years before anyone could save it. The Grand Resort, the fortnight by the sea, the diving tower and the theatre over the water, all of it has been burned or abandoned or surrendered to the tide, one piece at a time. And through every year of it, the sea has gone on doing the one thing it has always done. Twice a day it comes in across the flats, and twice a day it draws out again, almost a mile, back to the very edge of the world, leaving the town alone on its shining brown mud, with its ruins and its rescues, and its 4 million day trippers walking the sands where the water ought to be. Weston was built to reach out and hold the sea. The sea was never going to be held. If you found this one worth your time, the video on your screen tells another story much like it, and I think you are going to want to see how that one ends.